The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a wholly remarkable book, radio series, television series, some more books, and some various other media forms as well. Its high regard is certainly well earned. When it first debuted on radio in 1978, it was a revolutionary blend of interesting science fiction concepts and writer Douglas Adams' trademark wit. It is now, of course, most well known in the form of the novel series that Adams adapted from his original radio scripts, a trilogy that ended up having 5 increasingly bleak installments, plus an additional, much cheerier installment written by Eoin Colfer after Adams' death. This story has captured the hearts and minds of many across the world, and things such as the Babel fish and the answer to life, the universe, and everything are of course ubiquitous now. Given this status in pop culture, it was only inevitable that a film would be made, and in 2005 one was finally released, to somewhat of a mixed response apparently. Some people love it, like myself, but apparently lots more people very much do not, considering it an inferior version of Adams' vision. And while I certainly consider it the least best of the variations of the story I've experienced, and it certainly has some flaws, I still consider it to be a worthy adaptation of the vision Adams had for the galaxy and all the strange life that lives within it. Attempts at making Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy into a film had been going on since 1979, when the book had been released, and Adams briefly recounted once going to Hollywood in 1980 in one of the many failed attempts to try and write a script for one, backed by Ivan Reisman. Apparently, the studio that he was in talks to wanted Bill Murray or Dan Aykroyd for the role of Ford Prefect, which would have been some weird casting for sure, but was part of the inspiration for Adams to consider non-English actors for the role. However, after Reitman, Murray, and Aykroyd went off to make Ghostbusters instead, Adams put aside the script and didn't think much about it until 2001, when Jay Roach, fresh off his success with Austin Powers, decided to back Adams and get the movie made at last. Adams began work on a new script, and Roach began scouting directors such as Spike Jonze. To be honest, I could see it. His music video is definitely quirky enough for him to have pulled it off. But then, of course, tragedy struck. Douglas Adams died of heart failure in May 2001, leaving behind a near-complete script draft and a set of notes for several projects that included a half-finished entry into a series about the eccentric detective Dirk Gently, and notes on where he was headed to complete the Hitchhiker's Guide screenplay. Using the last completed draft and these notes, writer Carey Kirkpatrick completed the screenplay, intending it to be as close to Adams' vision as possible, and claiming that no idea in the final film did not come from Adams' notes. It is worth noting that one idea written into the final screenplay wasn't from Adams' notes, a moment that would have said that Trillian is only half human, but this ended up being cut from the movie anyway for what I imagine are obvious reasons. Now, with a screenplay finally finished and director Garth Jennings at the helm, the film could finally be underway. Did you ever really think it was going to? If there's one thing that's consistent about the story of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's that it is violently inconsistent. The first book is an adaptation of roughly the first 4 episodes of the radio show, with substantial changes being made to some of the characters, particularly Zaphod, and a new ending that totally changes the outcome of the shootout on Magrathea. The second book is a violently reworked version of episodes 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 5, and 6 of the radio series, in that order, with lots of things taken out and lots of other new things put in. The 1981 TV series is essentially the first 6 episodes of the radio show, but with plenty of additions as well, some taken from the books and some completely new. There is no one sacred version of the Hitchhiker's story to stick to, so any movie made about the story was going to be wildly different as well. It's just the nature of Hitchhikers, and something I honestly really appreciate about Adams' approach to adaptation. He knew how to keep it fresh. And as I stated earlier, everything that happens in this movie was what Adams wrote in his drafts and his notes before his death. So if the movie strayed a lot from his books and such, it's because he wanted it to go in that direction. So with that point out of the way, let's talk about the movie. If there's one thing that this film is undoubtedly good for, it's the production value. For a start, it's really well directed. This was Garth Jennings' first full feature film, but you'd never know it just watching this movie unfold. The film has a snappy pace, but manages to make sure all the jokes and little callbacks to previous iterations of the story land. It's very smartly made, and still has the quirkiness that the universe of Hitchhikers absolutely has to have. The cinematography is, somewhat surprisingly for an American comedy film, a treat to look at. This film is simply gorgeous to look at, and as far as I'm concerned, one of the best shot comedies of this century, if not the best. Every location the characters find themselves in has its own color palette, from the pleasant greens of countryside England to the uniform grey of Vogsphere to the biting blue cold of Magrathea. And while we're talking about stuff that looks really good in this movie, the visual effects. This movie was made in 2005, but 90% of the visual effects still really hold up. In fact, outside of 1 or 2 shots of the Heart of Gold, I can't really think of a visual effect that doesn't land. And this is down to the fantastic mix of CGI and practical effects. Most of the aliens present in this film are puppets, courtesy of Jim Henson's Creature Shop, and they all look marvelous, especially the Vogons, who spend a lot of time in this film front and center and look absolutely seamless. And of course, all the space stuff is CGI, but it is extremely well done CGI to the point of being genuinely beautiful. Like the Magrathian factory floor is just phenomenal, and watching the film again, I had the same awestruck face Arthur has when he arrives there. Of course, the CGI effects also managed to add some comedy, such as the frankly hilarious improbability drive effect. And on that note, this seamless transition from the wool joke to normality. It's all just so beautifully put together. Now, I can understand the point of view that a lot of fans have, that they much prefer the sort of naff done for 2 and 9pence Doctor Who-esque approach that the television series had for the world of Adam's Galaxy. And let's be honest, I am also in that camp to some extent. The television series in all its cheaply made glory also looks really good for the budget it was made on, and the naff special effects do give it a special charm. But at the end of the day, I will still appreciate this movie for what it did for this story visually. Also, this design for the Heart of Gold is far and away my favorite. Yes, I know the book describes it as a sort of running shoe looking affair, something that the TV show sticks to, but this design just feels so much more grandiose. Joey Talbot high-key snapped on the score for this movie. The atmosphere that Talbot set with his score is perfect for the universe of Hitchhikers. It's quirky, but manages to have an affair of grandness or an edge of darkness to it when it needs to. There are so many moments in this score that have lived in my head ever since I first saw this movie at the age of 6. The hilariously melodramatic score over the destruction of Earth, the ominous march that accompanies the Vogons, the majestic theme that plays over the Magrathian factory floor in Earthmark 2, and of course the music for the song So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. If that doesn't get stuck in your head at least once after watching this movie, I do not know what to say to you. There are also the little 8-bit-ish pieces that play under some of the entries in the guide, which perfectly capture the sort of laid-back approach to the book, and of course, the grandiose rearrangement of the Eagle's Journey of the Sorcerer to play over the introduction of the book. There isn't really a weak link in this score, which is definitely a rarity for comedy movie soundtracks, so I'm forever appreciative of Talbot for creating such a memorable soundtrack. The casting of this film is actually really good. Until I watched the TV series, most of these actors were the definitive version of the characters in my mind, and even after that, I still see 1 or 2 of these characters when I'm reading the books. Now we'll get this one out of the way because it's the one piece of casting I'm not 100% on, and that's Mos Def as Ford Prefect. Now there are definitely things I really like about his performance. Def's bizarre mannerisms make Ford seem a lot more alien than he does in a lot of other adaptations, and he's definitely very charming. But there's something that doesn't quite feel like Ford. Maybe it is the fact that Def plays a more obviously alien, whereas in the book and the TV show, the things that make people consider Ford are a little bit weird are a lot more subtle. None of this is to knock Def. I do like him in the role, but I always think I'll prefer David Dixon just a little bit more. Also, I think the costume design is Mr. Trick in making Ford as well dressed as he is. It always struck me that Ford should come very close to getting human fashion right, but ever so slightly miss, like he does in the TV series. Honestly, really like Zooey Deschanel's Trillian. I think she brought the character to life really nicely, and was definitely a massive step up from Sandra Dickinson's portrayal in the TV series, which is the only thing I actively dislike about that particular program. Of course, Zooey isn't a perfect Trillian. The book describes Trillian as having darker skin, which is something that no live-action version of the story seems to have gotten right yet, but I do really like the way that Zoe plays the character. Now to the casting decisions I do completely love. Martin Freeman was an absolutely perfect choice for Arthur Dent. There was no short order to follow up Simon Jones' iconic performance, but Freeman captured the permanently bewildered and confused energy of Arthur perfectly, while bringing his trademark Freeman charm to the role too. There's a great deal of pathos he brings to the role as well, especially in the latter half. Cannot think of anyone else who could have played Arthur in this movie as well as Freeman does. Also really love Sam Rockwell as Zaphod. Sure, he's a little more manic than most versions of Zaphod, but to me that actually really works for the character of the half-mad space celebrity / galactic president. Overall, Rockwell brings Zaphod to life in a highly entertaining manner, and would have been my favorite live-action adaptation of Zaphod had it not been the very strange approach taken to realizing Zaphod's second head. Also, Zaphod isn't dressed nearly badly enough for someone who was voted worst dressed sentient being in the universe 7 times on, but that's not on Rockwell either. And of course, I love Alan Rickman's work for Marvin. There was no more obvious choice for the paranoid android than Rickman, as he had mastered the "I'm so tired of everything" voice, though I suspect he was borrowing a little bit from his performance in Galaxy Quest. On top of that, Warwick Davis is the man inside the Marvin suit on set, and he adds a lot of character as well in the body language he gives to the character, from the permanently slumped shoulders to the tired and annoyed head shaking at the human's nonsense. This mix of Davis's great physicality and Rickman's sad voice makes Marvin feel so very real, and is honestly tied with Stephen Moore in terms of which version of Marvin I like more. I genuinely can't choose. Side note, I also love the design of Marvin in this movie. While the big head is a bit of an on-the-nose reference to his brain the size of a planet, it does add a certain amount of expressiveness to his character, and those downward triangle eyes just make him look so sad. If this is a real complaint you have, legitimately get over yourself. In the production of this film, Douglas Adams explicitly stated that only one of the characters in the film had to be British, Arthur Dent. After all, an Arthur Dent who wasn't constantly trying to find a cup of tea in space would just be wrong. Had this movie made Arthur an American, yes, it would have sucked. But for the others, let's break it down. First of all, I can see an argument for irritation at Trillian being an American. After all, Arthur did meet her at a party in Islington. However, nothing about Trillian's character says that she explicitly has to be British, so we can just assume that she moved from America to England at some point. And given that she's shown as having something of an adventurous side, it's not too much of a stretch to assume that she moved from America to London in search of a good time. And after all, this isn't the first time Trillian has been an American. She was too in the 1981 TV series, and I don't see too many people complaining about that, although most of everything else that Sandra Dickinson did with Trillian in that TV series is kind of annoying. And of course, most of everyone else in the movie is an alien, so it doesn't bloody matter what kind of accent they have. I think the guide deserves a section on its own because the portrayal of this element of the story is, of course, essential to get right, otherwise you're completely screwed. Fortunately, I think this movie did pretty well. First, we have the voice of the guide. Peter Jones, the original voice of the guide, had passed on by the time production began on the film, so finding a replacement for him would already be a difficult assignment, as Jones's voice had brought such an interesting personality to the guide. However, I think Stephen Fry was the perfect choice. While he obviously doesn't sound much like Peter Jones, he still gets the spirit of the guide completely right, explaining the quirks of the galaxy in a calm, friendly manner while still keeping a dry sense of humor about him, which is something that Fry has proven himself to be really good at anyway. In fact, I can't think of anyone else they could have gotten to do the guide aside from Fry. And then secondly, there are the animations that come with the guide, which I also really love. They don't have quite the same charm as the hand-drawn animations used in the 1981 TV series, which are of course iconic, but they're still really neat in their own way. The advent of CGI technology means that these animations are a lot more dynamic than the animations from the TV series, which leads to the ability to get more jokes into the animations in less time, which I think actually really helped add to the personality of the guide as a more laid-back source of knowledge and information. Whether or not you like the aesthetic of these animations is of course a completely subjective point, and I could understand why one might not like them, but personally I find them super entertaining, and to me the most logical direction that the animations would take in a Hitchhiker's movie made in the early 21st century. Well, now we have all those pieces together, but before I actually talk about what happens in the movie in more detail, I do want to get something out of the way really quickly. The one thing I actively don't like about this movie. The Arthur Trillian Zaphod love triangle is kinda stupid. This is the only thing in the movie I have a hard time believing was in Adam's notes for the movie, as this more than anything else feels like something being made to subscribe to the trope of, well, we have to have a love story built into this science fiction movie somewhere. And yes, in the later books, Arthur and Trillian have a strange relationship on account of Trillian having Arthur's child, whose name is Random for some reason. But in this movie, it really feels like it happens because the script said so. This love triangle nonsense seems awkwardly placed in this movie, and I really don't like it. Though it does indirectly lead to some interesting emotional beats here and there, so fine. Anyway, so with that out of the way. The movie begins with the guide's narration explaining that dolphins are smarter than humans, and then moves on to a frankly ridiculous yet extremely catchy musical number sung by dolphins that represents their last message to humanity.
So long. And thanks for all the fish.
And honestly, I can't think of a better representation of Adam's non-sequitur sense of humor than opening a science fiction film with an only tangentially relevant music number sung by dolphins that goes way harder than it has any right to. Anyway, at the end of the song, the dolphins yeet themselves off the planet, which is an inherently hilarious image, and the movie moves on to beginning the story, where immediately another flaw of the movie becomes obvious. A lot of the iconic exchanges at the beginning of the story are pared down to their absolute basics. Now I understand a lot of it probably had to be sacrificed in order to keep the movie going at a good pace, but a lot of my favorite lines from the exchange between Arthur and Mr. Prosser have been lost, for example. And I think that's a shame because I would have loved to see Martin Freeman do the bit where Arthur found the plans to have his house knocked down, or the joke about the window cleaner telling Arthur what was going to happen to his house. Anyway, Arthur lies in front of the bulldozers for a bit, and then Ford turns up with a trolley full of beer and takes Arthur to the pub, giving the beer to the construction workers on the condition that they don't demolish Arthur's house till they finish the beer. And honestly, my main question is what Ford was doing with that trolley in the first place. He only really needed the 6 pints that he and Arthur were going to be drinking anyway, so why did he bring a full trolley? It's almost as if he knew he was going to have to distract the builders, but he didn't know about the builders until he got there. So the question is, why is the trolley there? Plot convenience is why, which is irritating because they could have just done the joke about Ford making Prosser lie in front of the bulldozers instead. But oh well. Arthur and Ford pitch up to the pub where Ford explains that he's an alien. The movie adds here a flashback to when Arthur and Ford meet, which is an amusing vignette when Arthur saves Ford from trying to shake hands with a moving car. It's pretty funny, and a nice nod to the story story of how Ford came to choose the name Ford Prefect for himself when he ended up on Earth. We also see a flashback to the fancy dress party at which Arthur met Trisha McMillan, where we see Arthur embarrasses himself in front of a whole party.
All these people are idiots. God.
Which is pretty relatable, to be honest, and then shoot himself in the foot with Trisha by not going with her to Madagascar. And look, I get that going to Madagascar with someone you just met is going to be a bit much, but for God's sake, Arthur. Cornwall? Couldn't you have tried something like Paris? Or Amsterdam? Anyway, Zaphod picks up Trisha, and we return to the present where the builders start knocking down Arthur's house, and Arthur runs to what is left of it. It's at this point that the movie does something slightly different to previous iterations of Hitchhikers, and actually makes the end of Earth kind of terrifying. Like, the way the scene builds is actually kind of masterful, from the clouds rolling in over Arthur as he stands horrified in the wreckage, the quiet sounds of British countryside being replaced by the droning of the Vogon ships, the absolutely oppressive design of the Vogon ships, which aren't yellow like in the books, but definitely fit Adam's description of hanging in the sky in exactly the same way that bricks don't, the genuinely chilling alien sound of Jolt saying commence demolition, and most of all, the fact that Earth doesn't go out with a massive bang, but a kind of whoomph. Like, on the one hand, that's terribly funny, but also the idea of everything we know just vanishing with no fanfare at all, it's pretty scary shit if you ask me. And I have to hand it to Jennings for taking the joke of Earth being destroyed for the sake of a bypass and running that side by side with a frightening depiction of the end of Earth. It's really clever filmmaking, and by far my favorite version of the end of Earth in a Hitchhiker's adaptation. At this point, the movie gets a second title card as it introduces us to the guide itself, which is a pretty awesome introduction to the book, and we rejoin Arthur and Ford on the Vogon ship. It's not as clearly explained how they got on board here. The Dentrassi are noticeably absent, leaving me to believe that Ford's thumb is just a simple teleporting device, and the movie rushes through the guide entries for Vogons and Babelfish before the two are captured and sentenced to listening to Vogon poetry, which is also pretty much the same except for a bizarre sight gag involving a microphone, and some really nice visual references to Vogsphere, showing the Vogon gazelles and the scintillating jewel crabs that the Vogons love to abuse. I also really appreciate the addition of the line "some words I didn't understand" to Arthur's poetry appreciation moment. It's a very small thing for sure, but it's just so perfectly Arthur Dent. Side note, I really love the design of the Vogon ship interior. The fact that it looks like a concrete office block is a nice nod to the overly bureaucratic and completely unimaginative nature of the Vogons. So Arthur and Ford get thrown off the ship and then are rescued by the Heart of Gold. Pretty understandably, the movie gives the whole South End bit a miss. Look, I find it funny too, but it probably would have been dead weight in a movie, replacing it with an equally silly sight gag involving Arthur and Ford being momentarily turned into sofas. We are now introduced to Zaphod through the newscast about him stealing the Heart of Gold, which also sets up the Hummer Kavula side quest and gives my favorite joke about Zaphod being the president in the form of the Don't Vote for Stupid campaign, which does feel like something that would actually happen these days. And Trillian and Zaphod power through that argument about saving Arthur and Ford before sending Marvin down to bring them to the bridge. We get a quick cutaway to the Vogons, which serves to just make a joke about them having to sign request forms to go into hyperspace, and then we return to the Heart of Gold to see Marvin escort Arthur and Ford to the bridge and meet up with Zaphod and Trillian. While I am a little bit bummed at the loss of the joke about Zaphod and Ford trying to out-cool each other on seeing each other again, I'm more distracted by the fact that this scene is the one that introduces the love triangle I complained about earlier, and does it so quickly you don't have a lot of time to go, hang on, what? Before the Vogons drop out of hyperspace to intercept them. We're also introduced to this movie's iteration of Zaphod's second head, which is, why man? Although I am amused by the idea that one of Zaphod's heads is more of an asshole than the other one. Anyway, the Vogons drop out of hyperspace because they serve as the galaxy's muscle as well apparently. I'm assuming it's because the studio paid good money for those Vogon puppets and they were gonna get their money's worth. With them is Zaphod's Vice President Questular Runtok, a character completely new to the movie, which does raise the point of curiosity for the book. Did Zaphod have a vice president? Runtok begs Zaphod to cut the bullshit and return the Heart of Gold, to which Zaphod responds immediately by blasting the ship to hyperspace, which does raise the question of why the Heart of Gold has a hyperspace drive when it already has improbability drive. It's also in the scene that we get introduced to this movie's version of Eddie the shipboard computer, and to be honest, he is my preferred version of Eddie amongst the versions we've had. Thomas Lennon just captures the overly cheery nature of the computer perfectly. Ford and Zaphod share a pan-galactic gargle blaster and effectively demonstrate the idea of having your brain smashed out with a lemon wrapped around a large gold brick. Then Zaphod threatens Arthur to keep his mouth shut about the fate of Earth for reasons that will become more apparent later on. Trillian shows Arthur the kitchen, which is a cute reference to the Nutrimat machine, but then confuses the issue a little bit with a machine that can just make what you're craving. So why can't Arthur stick his head in that and get a proper cup of tea? There's a bit of pointless chatter about the love triangle I complained about earlier. Then Zaphod calls everyone down to watch a video about why he stole the Heart of Gold. A video that consists of the deep thought section of the book, minus the revelation that the computer to find the ultimate question is Earth. That comes later. later. Also, Deep Thought gives the answer to the ultimate question at just a few seconds shy of 42 minutes into this movie, which cannot be a coincidence. It's little details like that which show how much love was put into this movie. After this, Zaphod clarifies that he wants to find the ultimate question so he can get rich and famous, and activates the improbability drive in hopes they would just materialize at Magrathea, which in this movie is said to be a portal to the dimension the Deep Thought creators lived on, which does square with the books nicely. The movie takes a break for the guide's explanation of the infinite improbability drive, which tragically misses the joke about its inventor being murdered for being a smartass, and then the Heart of Gold drops out of improbability drive, temporarily made of wool, in what I think is a really cute and pretty funny little moment where everyone is a knitted doll. The crew are told they're in orbit of Viltvodel 6, and Zaphod puts off his quest for Magrathea to go down and settle a score with former political rival Hamikavula, who is apparently a minister for the Jetravarded religion, which believes that the universe was sneezed out of the nose of the Great Green Arkelseizure. It's revealed here that Hamikavula has coordinates for Magrathea, which he gives to Zaphod on the condition that he retrieves a gun designed by Deep Thought and leaves his second head and third arm behind as collateral. And putting aside that gruesome piece, Hamikavula scared the living shit out of me as a kid. Like, what the hell is this? Nightmare fuel, that's what it is. The Vogons arrive to arrest Zaphod for the kidnapping of the president, a joke based on Zaphod saying he was kidnapping himself when he stole the Heart of Gold, and they blindly shoot at the gang for a minute before arresting Trillian as an accomplice to the kidnapping. The rest of the gang escape in the Heart of Gold, but Arthur insists that they follow the ships to Vogsphere. Eddie announces that he can't do that as Trillian's mice have disabled his guidance system so he can only recognize the Magrathea coordinates, foreshadowing, so Arthur and the gang give chase in the hilariously small escape pod. As diversions from the source material go, I honestly really love this trip to Vogsphere, as it is a pretty hilarious portrait of the Vogons' reliance on bureaucracy, and also why they have absolutely no imagination whatsoever. Is the fly swatter gag intensely stupid? Yes, but it's also one of my favorite gags in this movie, so it definitely gets away with it. However, less amusing is the introduction of the lemon-powered thinking cap. I thought that was terribly funny at the age of 6, but the novelty has since worn off. So Arthur and the gang make it to the central Vogsphere city and find themselves in a queue signing forms for the release of Trillian, which does contain another of my favorite jokes about the sheer bureaucratic bloody-mindedness of the Vogons.
He's ordering you to let her go.
But this isn't a presidential release of prisoner form. Those are blue.
At the same time, Trillian is being sentenced to be eaten by the ravenous bug bladder beast of Trial, but only after she learns that Earth has been destroyed and that Zaphod signed the order. And I like that this is a plot point in this movie. The idea that Zaphod signed the order for the destruction of Earth was in the original radio series, but was since lost in most other adaptations, so seeing it appear again is a nice nod to the original radio program, I think. Arthur manages to get the form to save Trillian through, and she and Zaphod fight about the destruction of Earth before the gang get back in the escape pod and fly back to the Heart of Gold. The movie then moves on to a scene that, while it does contain a really nice emotional beat between Arthur and Trillian, is set in a bathroom for no reason I can think of aside from Zooey Deschanel in a shower eye candy purposes, which does strike me as a little cheap. The Heart of Gold makes it to Magrathea, and from this point the movie largely follows the books for a couple of minutes as the nuclear missiles are launched at the Heart of Gold after the Magrathean warning hologram tells them all to go away. By the way, I do love that the hologram is played by Simon Jones. It's a really nice piece of casting and a lovely nod to the radio series the story came from. I also really love the direction of this scene. While it does remove a couple of jokes, like the business about someone getting a bruise on their upper arm, I think for the purpose of the movie it's for the best, to keep the scene moving at a good pace. The cut to complete silence when the improbability drive is activated was also a really good choice for this scene, as it has a nice little sense of impact going from the hectic energy of the missiles chasing them to complete serenity. The missiles are turned into a bowl of petunias and a surprise whale, which drop to their dooms as Bill Bailey does a great rendition of the only thoughts the whale has before it dies. The Heart of Gold crew step out into the bitter landscape of Magrathea, coming across portals that lead to the Heart of Magrathea and the dimension from which the mice are from. This is obviously very different from how they get into the planet from the other versions of the story, but I imagine that a crack in the ground opened up by an exploding whale was probably deemed a bit too gross to put in a PG film. Arthur is accidentally left behind, stuck on an icy planet with Marvin, and the others find themselves in the mouse dimension, in front of Deep Thought. The conversation between Arthur and Marvin about the sunset is completely cut out here, replaced by Marvin's line about not knowing what to do about being a manically depressed robot. It is a shame to lose all of that, but then again I imagine they were concerned about possible pacing issues if they had retained it. And we did get Marvin's "I've seen it, it's rubbish" earlier, and his "I know, wretched isn't it" a little bit later. Anyway, Arthur is startled by Slarty Bartfast, who in this movie is played by Bill Nye, in a casting choice that is a departure from previous versions of the character, but works really well for the movie. I mean, I much more believe this version of Slarty Bartfast as someone who builds planets than the long-bearded Richard Vernon, much as I do love his take on the character as well. After a quick conversation, Slarty Bartfast fast activates one of the portals, taking Arthur into the heart of Magrathea and leaving Marvin alone on the surface. Arthur and Slarty Bartfast walk through a sort of waiting room, of which I kind of love the design, then step into an industrial cart which replaces Slarty Bartfast's car from the books, which might be a bit of a bummer for some, but here I think it works nicely to make the hyperspace bubble look a lot more like a construction site. The cart then takes the two down a tunnel, through a portal, and into the hyperspace factory floor, in my favorite scene in the entire movie. Everything about the scene is just gorgeous, from the stunning visual effects on the factory floor itself, to the score, to Martin Freeman really selling the overwhelming wonder you'd feel at seeing this for the first time, to the little details of the planets still in the factory. There's a planet that looks a little bit like Shada from Douglas Adams' unfinished Doctor Who serial, and a head-shaped one that looks a lot like Adams himself. It's just a perfectly constructed scene, and is something that is stuck in my head even from the first time I watched this all those years ago. We return to the mouse dimension, where Deep Thought tells Zaphod that she doesn't have the ultimate question and that the computer built for it had been destroyed by the Vogons, of course revealing that Earth had been that computer, and that Zaphod's carelessness had resulted in the loss of the question. There's a great mix of comedy and melancholia in this scene. There's the hilarious joke that Deep Thought's been watching TV for about 10 million years instead of doing literally anything else, and the tragedy of Zaphod realizing that his ambition had just amounted to absolutely nothing. Something that Rockwell sells really well here. Dejected, Zaphod goes to leave when Ford reminds about the gun they were sent to find, and Deep Thought opens a vault for them. In there they find the gun, which Zaphod attempts to use to kill himself, and ends in Ford getting shot, revealing the gun to be the point of view gun. Of all the concepts new to this movie, the point of view gun has to be my favorite. There are definitely shades of the total perspective vortex from the second radio series and second book in there, but as it is, it's a really funny idea, and the guide's explanation of the genesis of the gun is definitely the most Adams-esque piece of new writing in this movie.
It was designed by Deep Thought, but commissioned by a consortium of intergalactic angry housewives, who, after countless arguments with their husbands, were sick to the teeth of ending those arguments with the phrase, "You just don't get it, do you?"
Anyway, Zaphod makes the mistake of making an offhand comment about not giving a damn about Arthur, and in one of the film's most emotional moments, Trillian blasts him with a point of view gun. This whole bit is masterfully acted, I think. From Rockwell's mix of shock and understanding as he talks through everything that Trillian just blasted him with, to Mos Def's really quiet and sad looks to Trillian as he understands, and Zoe's anger melting into sadness as everything that's been tearing Trillian apart is finally put out there in the open. There's a lot of great stuff in this scene, and it's an emotional beat that I think was much needed in this movie. I've always found the lack of emotional beats surrounding the destruction of Earth and other versions of Hitchhikers a little bit odd, save for Arthur's meltdown in hyperspace in the first book, so it's really nice to see that loss properly affect the humans in this movie. However, the emotional scene is interrupted by the arrival of Trillian's mice, who dramatically zap the three of them. We return to Arthur and Slarty Bartfast, who are now crossing over the rebuilt version of Earth as Slarty explains the genesis of Earth to Arthur. I also really love this moment. Previous versions of this story have had Arthur and Slarty Bartfast sitting down in an office or in an air car zipping through hyperspace for this discussion, so having this explanation instead take place as Arthur watches the planet being rebuilt around him makes for a much more visually engaging moment. Also, moving the conversation between Arthur and the mice to his rebuilt house on Earth Mark II makes for a nice little symmetry moment. He's back to where he started, but not quite. Anyhow, Arthur goes into his living room to see his friends and the mice drug everyone and whip out a rather frightening looking machine in an attempt to take Arthur's brain to get the ultimate question. This scene, of course, contains the culmination of that irritating love story between Arthur and Trillian I've spent a fair amount of this video complaining about, but it does so in a way that's actually kind of nice. And it also contains one of my favorite comic bits in this movie.
It made me happy.
Rubbish, we don't want to be happy, we want to be famous.
Yeah.
What is all this is she the one tribe?
Take his brain!
Arthur manages to overpower the mice, but they don't have much time to breathe before the Vogons arrive, having somehow negotiated the portal on the surface to Magrathea to get to Earth Mark II. How did they get here? Would have taken ages to get that many Vogons through the portal, and they're far too big for the carts. Maybe they got their ships into the hyperspace tract that the factory floor is on, but how do they figure that out if that's the case? And that also doesn't add up because they were kind enough to bring Marvin along with them, so they had to use the portal somehow. How did they get here? I want answers! There's a massive shootout, which seems to have more to do with sci-fi movie gotta end on a shootout tropes than anything else, and Marvin is hit in the head in the crossfire. But don't worry, that is but a minor inconvenience, as in the confusion the point of view gun was dropped near him, so when he reboots he's able to use it to take out an entire army of Vogons through the sheer power of his depression, which is another one of my favorite jokes in this movie, and a nice nod to the book, where Marvin inadvertently saves a gang from space cops by talking to their ship's computer until it commits suicide. side. And yeah, after that, the movie's pretty much over. The gang return to the Heart of Gold to go to the restaurant at the end of the universe, this time with Questrula Runtok in tow, and Earth Mark II is released into the universe, which is a much more optimistic fate for Earth than the original books. While it is implied that the new Earth was put out into space in so long and thanks for all the fish, Mostly Harmless made sure to kill any sense of optimism there. Oh, and the joke about the massive battle fleet getting eaten by a small dog is preserved in the end credits, which is also a nice little moment. For some reason, I like the fact that the last line in the movie is,
Those who study the complex interplay of cause and effect in the history of the universe say that this sort of thing is going on all the time.
Do you think it was a bit strange? He was trying to shake hands with the car.
I assumed you were drunk. I said all these people are idiots. God.
Bored?
Yes.
I think I'm a sofa.
I know how you feel.
Hama Kavula is of course best remembered for his slanderous "Don't Vote for Stupid" campaign.
Freeze!
Freeze?
Hippity-doo.
I'm a robot, not a refrigerator.
I wasn't talking to you, Giggles.
Oh, why do I bother? I want to get off.
And incidentally, you are stupid.
So they found where we are. Belgian bummer.
Bummer? They're shooting at us.
Marvin.
I've been talking to the ship's computer.
And?
It hates me.
No. Okay, Marvin, any ideas?
I have a million ideas. They all point to certain death.
Thanks very much, Marvin.
I have an idea.
Marvin, can you give me a hand?
Give me a hand. Ha ha. Very funny. How am I supposed to drive this pod with one arm, stupid human?
But this isn't a presidential release of prisoner form. Those are blue.
Got your arm.
How considerate. Incredible. It's even worse than I thought it would be.
Normality, right. We can talk about normality till the cows come home.
What is normal?
What's home?
What are cows?
Hello, ground. Go with the hunt of a man whose brain is fueled by lemons.
Okay, but you can't have my brain. I'm using it.
Hardly. Rubbish, we don't want to be happy, we want to be famous. Yeah. What is all this "is she the one" tribe? Take his brain!
Oh.
He's got a towel! Run away! Oh, he's jumping back from the other side! We'll have to go the other way!
Is this movie as great as the books upon which it is based? Definitely not. But it is a worthy adaptation for the story for sure, and having rewatched it a couple of times for this video, I completely failed to see where some of the hate for it comes from. Are there some bad choices made in the writing of this movie? Oh, for sure. But overwhelmingly, most of the decisions made were really good, and occasionally managed to shed some new light onto some scenes that had been done the same way time and time again, such as the factory floor sequence. Overall, it's an extremely enjoyable film, and was, for the record, the first favorite movie I ever had. To be honest, it still probably has a hand in my taste in movies to this day. It's a bit of a sidetrack. Point is, it's far better than it's ever given credit for, and I think if some of you gave it another chance, you might like it more.
I've seen it. It's rubbish.
Shut up, Marvin.